On February 20th, 2026, President Trump gave Iran somewhere between 10 and 15 days to agree to a nuclear deal, warning that missing that window would be, in his words, unfortunate for Iran. That was 5 months ago. Since then, that same basic warning, in one form or another, has been repeated, extended, walked back, and reissued more times than I can cleanly count in a single breath. So, before I tell you about this week's version of the U.S. has run out of patience, I want you to hold on to that history because it's the single most important piece of context for judging whether this time is actually the moment things finally break, or just the latest entry in a pattern that's been running since before the war even started. Quick sourcing note, because a claim like ran out of patience needs it. Everything here draws from Al Jazeera, PBS News through Associated Press wire reporting, the Washington Times, Fox News, and an independent geopolitical analysis newsletter called Navigating the Vortex that's been tracking the specific mechanics of the ceasefire agreement in detail. I'll flag clearly anywhere a claim comes from just one side's own statements, rather than being independently corroborated. Stick with me, because the actual collapse of the peace framework this month is a genuinely more complicated story than Iran stalled and the U.S. struck back. Let's start with what actually happened this past week, because it's the most concrete part of this story. Iran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, declared that the country's armed forces now have what he called complete freedom of action against what he termed the enemy's aggression, after a day of American attacks killed 7 Iranian troops. Ghalibaf said the interim peace deal Iran and the U.S. had agreed to back on June 17th was effectively voided, and described Iran as now fighting what he called an existential war. Separately, an Iranian negotiator said Tehran had suspended its commitments under that same interim deal entirely, as the two countries traded strikes aimed at both infrastructure and military targets. CENTCOM confirmed its 7th consecutive night of strikes that same week, hitting what it described as surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapons storage, and maritime capabilities. The human cost from this specific stretch is documented directly by Iran's own health ministry, which reported that at least 50 people have been killed and more than 500 injured in U.S. strikes since July 6th. I want to flag that figure as coming from Iran's government health authority rather than an independent international body, which is a meaningfully different category of source than, say, an outside monitoring group, though it's also not a figure I've seen directly disputed by other reporting on the same strikes. Separately, Iran reported that a desalination plant had been struck, leaving roughly 10,000 people without water. In direct response to the killing of the 7 Iranian troops and the broader breakdown, the U.S. reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, specifically to halt Iran's oil shipments, on top of strikes that, according to PBS's reporting, expanded into hitting bridges inside Iran and a water desalination plant in Kuwait as well. Let's talk about oil in the Strait specifically, because that's become the central battleground determining how patient either side is actually being. Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz to shipping traffic after the war first began on February 28th, and that closure has functioned as one of Iran's most significant sources of leverage in every round of negotiations since. The price of oil rose above $86 a barrel this past week, close to its highest level in a month, as crossings through the strait fell to a 3-week low according to an international shipping tracker. Iran's government has explicitly called the strait a red line, and the pattern of the past several months shows that virtually every time negotiations show even modest progress, a new flare-up around the strait specifically tends to be what unravels it. Now, here's where I think this story gets genuinely more interesting than the headline suggests, because the U.S. just ran out of patience implies this is a sudden, uncharacteristic shift after a long period of restraint. The actual record shows something different. American ultimatums, deadlines, and threats of running out of patience have been a nearly constant feature of this entire conflict, dating back to before the shooting even started. Go back to that February 20th deadline I opened with. At the time, Iran and Russia had just conducted joint military drills. A second American aircraft carrier had arrived in the Middle East, and Iran had conducted live fire drills of its own in the Strait of Hormuz. Both countries, by multiple accounts, appeared ready for war if the nuclear talks failed. 5 days later, on February 25th, a third round of diplomatic negotiations convened in Geneva, with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi expressing what was described as cautious optimism, calling an unprecedented deal within reach if diplomacy was prioritized. Those talks were happening, notably while Iran was facing intense international scrutiny over its own internal crackdown on nationwide protests that January, which human rights groups at the time reported, had killed at least 7,000 people and led to tens of thousands of detentions. I want to flag that specific casualty figure clearly as a human rights group's estimate from that period, rather than a government-confirmed number. since internal unrest casualty figures in Iran have historically been difficult to verify independently and have varied significantly across different reporting at different times throughout this crisis. Despite that brief window of diplomatic optimism, the war began just 3 days later, on February 28th. And even after the shooting started, the pattern of extended deadlines didn't stop. It just shifted from a pre-war ultimatum to a wartime one. By late March, Trump was still issuing conditional threats specifically tied to infrastructure, announcing a 5-day extension of his deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and holding off on threatened strikes against Iran's power plants, citing what he described as very good and productive recent discussions between American and Iranian officials. Here's the part worth sitting with directly. Iranian state media, through the semi-official Mehr news agency, responded to that same announcement by firmly denying that any direct dialogue was taking place between the two countries at all, and suggested Trump's optimistic framing was intended mainly to ease pressure on global energy markets and buy time for further military planning. That's not a minor disagreement about tone. That's the two governments giving flatly contradictory accounts of whether talks were even happening, in real time, during the same 24-hour news cycle. That gap between American announcements of progress and Iranian denials that any real progress exists has shown up repeatedly across this war, and it matters enormously for how skeptically you should read any single patience has run out declaration, including this week's version. If American officials have, at multiple points, described talks as productive while Iranian officials were simultaneously denying those talks were substantive at all, then it becomes much harder to take either side's framing of who's actually stalling fully at face value without independent verification. Let's fast forward to the interim deal that's now reportedly collapsed, because understanding exactly how it was built explains a lot about why it fell apart so easily. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, signed on June 17th, declared what it called the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, and committed both parties not to use or threaten force going forward. According to detailed analysis from Navigating the Vortex, tracking the agreement's actual mechanics, the deal was structurally flawed from the moment it was signed, specifically because it failed to establish a robust enforcement mechanism. A high-level committee was created for political oversight involving senior figures including U.S., Vice President J.D. Vance and Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi. But that same analysis notes the mechanism simply didn't function as intended once renewed hostilities broke out over disagreements, specifically about the Strait of Hormuz, the exact same flashpoint that's driven nearly every other collapse in this war's various ceasefire attempts. That same analysis makes an important point about the deal's actual structure that's worth understanding directly. The MOU included a provision allowing its 60-day negotiating timeline to be extended by mutual agreement, and the analysis suggests that provision, rather than any genuine pathway to lasting peace, may end up being the agreement's real, enduring function. Not resolving the underlying dispute, but giving both countries a structured holding pattern that prevents a full slide back into all-out war, even when, as happened this month, actual fighting resumes in the meantime. As of that analysis, with just over 40 days remaining in that 60-day window, Iran's refusal to engage directly with top American negotiators, opting instead for indirect talks, was already flagged as a bad sign for the framework's survival, even before this month's collapse into active strikes made that concern concrete. Before I go further, let me clear up a few claims circulating around this specific story, because a phrase like "ran out of patience" tends to get repeated without much scrutiny of what came before it. Claim 1, that this month's collapse represents the first real breakdown of diplomacy since the war began, making it a genuinely unprecedented moment. It isn't. As covered above, the pattern of announced diplomatic progress, followed by denial or renewed hostilities, has repeated at nearly every stage of this conflict. Before the war started in February, during the power plant deadline extension in March, and again around the June memorandum's signing and near immediate unraveling. This month's collapse fits an established pattern rather than breaking new ground. Claim 2, that Iran's suspension of its commitments under the interim deal means Iran alone is responsible for the deal's collapse. The available reporting doesn't support assigning sole responsibility that cleanly. The renewed hostilities that undid the June 17th memorandum specifically trace back to disagreements over the Strait of Hormuz, an issue both governments have handled with escalating military pressure rather than sustained restraint, and the killing of 7 Iranian troops in the days before Ghalibaf's statement was itself an American strike, not an Iranian provocation that came first in that specific sequence. Claim 3, that the naval blockade being reimposed this month represents some brand new escalation tool the U.S. hadn't used before. It isn't new. A naval blockade on Iranian ports has been imposed, referenced, and reimposed at multiple points across this war's various phases, tied closely to the broader Strait of Hormuz campaign I've covered in earlier videos. Call Calling this month's reimposition unprecedented overstates how novel this specific tool actually is within the broader conflict. Claim 4, that the 60-day negotiating window built into the June memorandum has now definitively expired with no path forward. Based on the reporting available, that window includes a provision allowing extension by mutual agreement specifically, which means the practical deadline is more flexible than a hard 60-day cutoff might suggest. Whether both sides choose to invoke that extension provision, given this month's active hostilities, remains an open question rather than something already resolved one way or the other. It's worth spending a little more time on just how consistent the deadline that gets extended pattern has been across this entire conflict, because I think seeing all of it laid out together is more revealing than any single instance of it. The first ultimatum came before a shot was fired, when Trump gave Iran roughly 2 weeks in February to reach a deal. That deadline came and went, folded into a third round of Geneva talks that briefly raised hopes before the war began just days later anyway. Once the war was underway, deadlines shifted from reach a deal or face war to meet this condition or face escalated strikes. The March power plant deadline being the clearest example, extended specifically because officials described talks as productive, even as Iranian state media denied those same talks were happening in any substantive form. Then came the June memorandum, which was supposed to represent the actual end of active hostilities rather than just another paused deadline, and even that collapsed within roughly a month once the Strait of Hormuz dispute reignited. Each of these episodes, taken individually, might look like a distinct crisis point. Taken together, they look more like a single, long-running cycle that keeps resetting at a slightly different stage of the underlying conflict, without ever fully resolving the core dispute driving all of it. I think it's also worth being specific about what running out of patience would actually need to look like for it to represent a genuine structural shift rather than another turn of the same cycle. A genuine shift would probably involve the U.S. abandoning the extension and renegotiate pattern entirely, either through a dramatically expanded military campaign explicitly aimed at forcing capitulation rather than pressuring a return to talks, or through Congress and the broader domestic political system pushing hard enough to force a formal public end to open-ended American involvement, given the war powers debates this conflict has already generated. Neither of those developments is clearly present in this week's news based on the reporting available. What's happened is another round of strikes, another blockade reimposition, and another public statement from Iran describing the framework as suspended, all of which map closely onto the previous cycles rather than obviously departing from them. Is Iran genuinely stalling, and has the U.S. genuinely run out of patience? Or is this characterization doing more rhetorical work than factual work? I think the honest answer requires holding two things at once. On one hand, there's a real documented pattern of Iran denying that substantive diplomacy is happening even when American officials describe talks as productive, opting for indirect rather than direct negotiation channels, and treating its ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz as leverage, it's unwilling to give up without extracting real concessions first. All of which fits a recognizable pattern of a negotiating party slow-walking a process it may not be fully invested in resolving quickly. On the other hand, the American side's own conduct doesn't fit a simple, patient, good-faith negotiating posture either. Deadlines have been issued and then repeatedly extended or reissued since before the war even began. Strikes on Iranian infrastructure, including water and power systems, have continued and expanded even during periods officials described as productive diplomatic progress, and the naval blockade has been imposed, apparently eased, and reimposed multiple times across this conflict's various phases. That's not the behavior of a party that's been carefully patient until finally reaching a genuine breaking point this week. It's closer to a sustained multi-month pattern of pressure and escalation that periodically gets paused for diplomatic openings that haven't yet produced a durable result. I also think it's worth naming the domestic political pressure shaping the American side of this specifically, because it complicates the simple ran out of patience framing further. Trump now faces real political pressure to bring this war to a close and avoid exactly the kind of prolonged Middle Eastern conflict he'd campaigned against entering in the first place. That creates a genuine tension in how the administration frames each new escalation. Strikes need to be framed as decisive, patience-exhausting responses to Iranian bad faith, in part because framing them as just another round in an already long, open-ended conflict would cut directly against the political promise that got the administration into office. That doesn't mean the strikes aren't militarily justified on their own terms, but it does mean the specific rhetorical framing of ran out of patience at this exact moment serves a political purpose beyond simply describing the military reality accurately. I think it's also fair to look at this from the other side and ask what would actually count as evidence that Iran is genuinely, deliberately stalling, rather than navigating a genuinely difficult set of internal and external constraints. Iran's government, remember, is operating under conditions that would strain any state's negotiating capacity. a leadership succession following the assassination of its previous supreme leader, a documented internal economic crisis with the currency collapsing, and sustained nationwide protests, and now months of direct military strikes degrading its naval and military infrastructure simultaneously. A government under that much simultaneous internal and external pressure may genuinely struggle to negotiate quickly and decisively, even without any deliberate strategy of stalling. Internal factional disagreements over how much to concede, which I've covered in earlier breakdowns of Iran's leadership tensions, could easily produce exactly the kind of slow, inconsistent, indirect negotiating posture that looks like deliberate stalling from the outside, even if it's actually closer to a fractured government struggling to reach internal consensus under wartime pressure. Here's my honest read, coming at this the way I try to approach every one of these breakdowns, weighing the documented pattern rather than either side's framing of this particular week. I don't think Iran is stalling, and the US ran out of patience are inaccurate descriptions exactly. But I think both undersell how long and how repetitive this exact cycle has already been. This isn't the first time in this war that a deadline has been set, extended, and then abandoned once a new flashpoint, usually the Strait of Hormuz specifically, reignited hostilities. It's happened in February before the war even started, again in March during the power plant deadline extension, again around the June 17th memorandum signing and rapid unraveling, and now again this month. Recognizing that pattern doesn't make this week's escalation any less serious or any less costly in real human terms. The deaths, the injuries, and the 10,000 people left without water are all real regardless of how many times this basic cycle has repeated. But it does mean I'd encourage real skepticism toward any framing, suggesting this is a uniquely decisive turning point, given how many previous turning points in the same conflict have instead settled back into another version of the same underlying stalemate within a matter of weeks. Let me also walk through the internal pressures on Iran's side specifically, because that context matters for interpreting whether Tehran's negotiating posture reflects deliberate stalling or something closer to a government struggling to act coherently under simultaneous strain. Iran's leadership succession, following the assassination of its previous supreme leader back in February, put a relatively untested figure in charge of a government now managing an active war on multiple fronts at once. Layer onto that a currency that's lost most of its remaining value, sustained nationwide protests tied to economic collapse, and a documented pattern of internal factional disagreement over how hardline a posture to take toward the U.S. And you get a plausible alternative explanation for indirect, inconsistent negotiating behavior that doesn't require assuming a single coordinated strategy of deliberate delay. Governments under that much simultaneous pressure often struggle to present a single, consistent negotiating position, not because they're strategically stalling, but because different factions within the same government may be pulling toward different outcomes at the same time, producing exactly the kind of inconsistent signals that look, from outside, like stalling. That's not to say Iran isn't also using time itself as a deliberate form of leverage. A state absorbing sustained military pressure has real incentives to draw out negotiations if it believes conditions might shift in its favor, whether through international pressure on the U.S. to end the war, through degraded American political will as the conflict drags on, or simply through the accumulating cost of the war becoming harder for Washington to sustain domestically. Both explanations, deliberate strategic delay and genuine internal dysfunction under wartime pressure, can be true simultaneously, and untangling exactly how much of Iran's negotiating behavior reflects one versus the other is extremely difficult to do with confidence from outside the room, where those decisions are actually being made. I also want to touch on how the framing of patience specifically tends to function in American wartime political messaging more broadly, because it's a recurring rhetorical device that shows up across many conflicts, not just this one. Describing a military escalation as the result of running out of patience implicitly frames the acting government as the reasonable, restrained party that was pushed into action only after good faith efforts failed, while framing the adversary as the one whose bad faith forced the escalation. That framing may be entirely accurate in a given instance, but it's also exactly the kind of language governments reach for, regardless of how accurate it actually is, precisely because it's rhetorically effective at building domestic and international support for continued military action. Recognizing that the language itself carries a persuasive function, separate from whatever the underlying facts actually show, is part of why I've tried throughout this video to focus on the documented pattern of deadlines, extensions, and strikes, rather than accepting the patience framing at face value simply because it's the language being used this week. I think it's also fair to ask what a genuine off-ramp from this specific cycle would actually require, since simply cataloging the repetition doesn't tell you how it might eventually end. Based on the structural analysis of the June memorandum, a durable resolution would likely need something the agreement never had in the first place, an enforcement mechanism with real teeth, capable of holding either side accountable for violations without requiring the other side to unilaterally resume strikes as its only available response. Absent that kind of mechanism, every future ceasefire or interim deal this conflict produces is likely to face the same basic vulnerability the June agreement did: a single disputed incident, especially anything touching the Strait of Hormuz specifically, capable of unraveling months of diplomatic work within days. Until negotiators on both sides address that structural gap directly, rather than simply signing another version of the same kind of agreement, I'd expect this exact pattern of announced progress followed by rapid collapse to keep repeating, regardless of how many additional rounds of the U.S. has run out of patience or Iran is suspending its commitments get issued along the way. There's an economic dimension to this specific cycle worth spelling out too, because oil prices function almost as a real-time barometer of how seriously markets are taking any given round of "this time it's serious" rhetoric. Oil climbing above $86 a barrel this week, alongside a 3-week low in Strait crossings, shows traders pricing in real near-term disruption risk. But it's worth noting that figure sits well below some of the war's earlier peaks, when Brent crude traded above $113 a barrel during the spring blockade period. That gap suggests markets, much like the shipping and insurance industry data I've covered in earlier breakdowns of this war, have developed their own accumulated skepticism toward any single week's escalation, pricing in real risk without fully assuming the worst-case indefinite closure scenario each time a new round of hostilities breaks out. That's its own kind of evidence about how this cycle is being read by the people whose job is to price this risk professionally, day to day, rather than to cover it as a single dramatic news story. If you want the confirmed version of a conflict this repetitive and this easy to lose track of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I plan to keep tracking each new deadline, extension, and collapse against this same longer pattern, rather than treating each one as a fresh, standalone story. And drop a comment telling me what you want covered next. A closer look at the specific structural flaws in the Islamabad memorandum that made it so easy to unravel, or a deeper dive into what's actually happening inside Iran's negotiating team, given the leadership and internal pressures I've covered in earlier videos. I read every comment, and it shapes what gets covered next.